Welcome back to Horizons of the Mind, where we dive deep into the questions that have shaped human consciousness across cultures and centuries. Picture this. You're standing at a crossroads between two worlds. Down one path, you see 11th century Baghdad, the golden age of Islamic civilization. In a quiet corner of the Nizamiya school, Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali sits in contemplation, his masterwork Ihya Ulum al-Din spread before him. Down the other path lies 17th century Holland, where René Descartes huddles by his stove on a winter night, methodically doubting everything he thought he knew about reality. Both men are grappling with the same fundamental question: what happens to the soul when we die? But here's what's fascinating. They arrive at completely different answers. One sees death as the soul's ultimate reunion with the divine. The other sees it as the separation of an immortal mind from a mortal body. Which path speaks to you? The mystical certainty of the East or the rational skepticism of the West? Your answer might reveal more about your own relationship with mortality than you think. Today, we're going to explore how two of history's most influential thinkers approached death, and how their radically different conclusions still shape how billions of people understand their own mortality. The Great Divide: two approaches, two ultimate questions. Before we dive into their specific views on death, we need to understand the profound difference in how these two philosophers approached knowledge itself. Because how you seek truth fundamentally shapes what truths you find about death. Al-Ghazali lived in what many historians call the Islamic Golden Age. This was a time when Baghdad was perhaps the most intellectually vibrant city on earth. Greek philosophy had been translated into Arabic. Mathematical innovations were flowing from India, and Islamic scholars were synthesizing knowledge from across the known world. But by the late 11th century, Ghazali witnessed something troubling. He saw rationalist philosophers becoming so enamored with logical proofs that they were losing touch with the deeper spiritual realities that, in his view, gave life meaning. This led to what he called his spiritual crisis. Despite mastering law, theology, and philosophy, Al-Ghazali found himself plagued by doubt. Not doubt about God's existence, but doubt about whether intellectual knowledge alone could lead to real understanding. This crisis drove him to leave his prestigious position and embark on a mystical journey that would reshape Islamic thought. Descartes, 5 centuries later, experienced his own crisis of doubt, but his response was completely different. Sitting by his stove during the harsh winter of 1619, Descartes decided to doubt everything: his senses, his beliefs, even mathematical truths. But, unlike Ghazali, who sought certainty through mystical experience, Descartes sought it through pure reason. This fundamental difference in approach, one seeking truth through the heart's illumination, the other through the mind's clear reasoning, would color everything they said about death. Al-Ghazali, Death as Divine Reunion. Let's start with Al-Ghazali's revolutionary understanding of death. In his masterpiece, Ihya Ulum al-Din, he presents death not as an ending, but as an awakening. But here's what made his approach so distinctive in Islamic scholarship. He didn't just rely on Quranic verses or prophetic traditions. He combined scriptural authority with deep psychological insight and mystical experience. For Ghazali, death begins long before the body stops breathing. In his Remembrance of Death and the Afterlife, the final book of the Ihya, he describes what we might call the death before death, the gradual detachment from worldly concerns that allows the soul to prepare for its ultimate journey. Think about this for a moment. How often do we consider the dying might be something we need to practice? Ghazali believed that every night when we sleep,
we experience a form of death. The soul partially separates from the body, travels through spiritual realms, and then returns upon waking. Dreams, he argued, are glimpses of the soul's true nature, freed from the limitations of physical existence. This wasn't just poetic metaphor for Al-Ghazali. Drawing from Quranic verses and prophetic traditions, he saw sleep as a powerful analogy for understanding the soul-body relationship during the dying process. But here's where Ghazali gets really interesting. He doesn't just tell us what happens at death, he gives us a detailed roadmap of the soul's journey. According to his understanding, drawn from Islamic sources and his own mystical experiences, death involves several stages. First comes the sakarat al-maut, the agonies of death. But Ghazali insists these aren't necessarily physical pain. They're the soul's struggle to detach from a lifetime of worldly attachments. The person who has spent their life preparing for death through spiritual discipline experiences this transition as liberation. The person who has remained attached to material concerns experiences it as anguish. After the soul separates from the body, Ghazali describes what Islamic theology calls the barzakh, an intermediate state between earthly life and the final resurrection described in the Quran. This isn't just a waiting room. According to Islamic understanding, which Ghazali elaborates upon, it's an active state where the soul experiences consequences related to its earthly choices and continues to develop spiritually. Now here's a question that might challenge your assumptions. Do you think consciousness requires a physical brain? Ghazali would say absolutely not. For him, consciousness is a property of the soul, not the body. The soul uses the brain like a rider uses a horse, but the rider isn't the horse. This brings us to one of Ghazali's most profound insights about death. He argues that what we call death is actually birth into a higher form of existence. The soul, freed from the body's limitations, can perceive spiritual realities that were hidden during earthly life. It's like a prisoner being released from a dark cell into brilliant sunlight. But, and this is crucial, this isn't automatic. Ghazali insists that the soul's post-mortem experience depends entirely on its spiritual development during life. The person who cultivated spiritual awareness, practiced detachment from worldly concerns, and developed what he calls fana, self-annihilation in the divine presence, experiences death as the ultimate fulfillment. They return to their source, like a river flowing back to the ocean.
Descartes' The Rational Dualist's Mortality. Now let's journey to 17th century Europe, where René Descartes was revolutionizing how we think about mind and body, and therefore about death itself. Descartes' famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, wasn't just a clever philosophical slogan, it was his foundation for addressing the problem of mortality. Through his method of systematic doubt, Descartes discovered one thing he couldn't doubt, his own existence as a thinking being. Even if an evil demon were deceiving him about everything else, the very fact that he was being deceived proved he existed. But the cogito was just the first step in Descartes' reasoning. From this foundation of certain self-knowledge, he built a more complex argument. He realized that this thinking self, what he called res cognitans, was entirely distinct from his physical body, the res extensa. This wasn't immediately obvious from the cogito alone, but required further reasoning. Descartes argued that he could clearly and distinctly conceive of himself existing as a thinking being without any physical properties. Since he could conceive of mind and body as separate substances, And since clear and distinct ideas correspond to real possibilities, mind and body must be different substances entirely. This had earth-shattering implications for understanding death. If the mind and body are truly separate substances, then the death of the body doesn't necessarily mean the death of the mind. Through this multi-step reasoning, not directly from the cogito, but building upon it, Descartes concluded that the soul is immortal. In his Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes offers what he considers a rational demonstration of the soul's immortality. The argument goes like this: I can clearly and distinctly conceive of myself existing without a body. What I can clearly and distinctly conceive must be possible. Therefore, it's possible for my mind to exist without my body. And if it's possible, then the mind must be a different substance from the body entirely. But wait, doesn't this sound almost too neat? Critics immediately pounced on this reasoning. Just because you can imagine something doesn't mean it's actually possible in reality. I can imagine myself flying without wings, but that doesn't make it physically possible. Descartes anticipated this objection. He distinguished between mere imagination and clear, rational insight. When he contemplated his own existence as a thinking being, he wasn't just imagining, he was having a direct, rational intuition of his own nature. This wasn't wishful thinking, it was, he claimed, as certain as a mathematical proof. Here's where Descartes differs dramatically from Ghazali. Where the Islamic philosopher relied on mystical experience and scriptural revelation, Descartes insisted that reason alone could solve the mystery of death. No special spiritual practices required, no divine illumination needed, just careful, methodical thinking. For Descartes, death is fundamentally simple. It's the moment when the soul, the thinking substance, separates from the body, the extended substance. The body, being purely mechanical, simply stops functioning. The soul, being non-physical, continues existing in whatever realm incorporeal substances inhabit. But this raises a fascinating question. If the soul is completely separate from the body, how do they interact during life? This became known as the interaction problem, and it plagued Cartesian philosophy for centuries. How can something with no physical properties, the soul, move something physical, the body? How can physical events like brain injuries affect something non-physical, consciousness? Descartes' answer involved what he called the pineal gland, a small structure in the brain that he thought served as the meeting point between soul and body. Critics found this explanation unsatisfactory, and the interaction problem remains one of the most challenging issues in philosophy of mind today.
The great contrast, heart versus head. Now that we've explored both perspectives, let's examine the fundamental differences between these two approaches to death and what they reveal about different ways of understanding human nature itself. First, consider their sources of authority. Ghazali drew from the Quran, the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, the experiences of Sufi mystics, and his own spiritual insights. For him, truth about death couldn't be discovered through reason alone. It required revelation, spiritual practice, and divine illumination. The heart, properly purified and attuned to spiritual realities, could perceive truths that the intellect could never reach. Descartes, by contrast, deliberately set aside all received authority. He wanted to build knowledge from the ground up, using only what he could establish through clear and distinct rational insight. Tradition, scripture, and even sensory experience were suspect. Only what could pass the test of systematic doubt deserved acceptance. This difference in method led to different conclusions about the nature of death itself. For Ghazali, death was fundamentally about relationship. The soul's relationship with God, with its own spiritual development, and with the community of believers. The quality of death depended on the quality of these relationships during life.
For Descartes, death was fundamentally about substance, the separation of two different types of existence. It was more like a scientific fact than a spiritual event. Whether death was good or bad wasn't really the point. What mattered was understanding what it actually was. Here's a question to consider. Which approach resonates more with your own intuitions about death? Do you see it primarily as a relational, spiritual event, or as a natural, mechanical process? These different approaches also led to different practical implications. Ghazali's understanding of death demanded lifelong spiritual preparation. He advocated regular practices of remembering death, detaching from worldly concerns, and cultivating awareness of God's presence. Death wasn't just something that happened to you, it was something you prepared for actively. Descartes' view suggested a more intellectual preparation, understanding the true nature of mind and body, recognizing the soul's immortality through rational demonstration, and living according to clear moral principles derived from reason. Death would take care of itself if you understood it correctly. The question of evidence. This brings us to a crucial question. How can we evaluate these competing claims about what happens when we die? Both philosophers were dealing with what we might call the ultimate unknown, something that, by definition, living humans can't directly verify. Ghazali would argue that mystical experience provides evidence. The advanced Sufi who achieve states of fana, temporary dissolution of individual consciousness into divine consciousness, gets a preview of what death will bring. The person who experiences prophetic dreams or visionary states has glimpsed the soul's true nature. But how can we verify such experiences? Different mystics report different visions. How do we distinguish genuine spiritual insight from imagination, wishful thinking, or even mental illness? Descartes would argue that reason provides better evidence than mystical experience. If we can demonstrate through logical argument that the mind must be separate from the body, we don't need to rely on subjective experiences that might be delusory. Mathematical truths don't depend on personal visions. They're universally valid. But critics pointed out problems with Descartes' rational arguments too. Is it really true that we can conceive of mind existing without body? When you imagine yourself existing without a physical form, aren't you still imagining yourself as having some kind of spatial presence, some way of perceiving and interacting with reality? Modern neuroscience has added another layer of complexity. We now know that specific brain injuries can alter personality, memory, and even moral reasoning in precise ways. If consciousness really were separate from the brain, why would physical brain changes affect mental states so predictably? Yet the problem remains. We still can't fully explain how subjective experience arises from objective brain processes. The hard problem of consciousness, explaining why there's something it's like to be conscious rather than just neural processing happening, remains unsolved.
Living with mystery. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that both Ghazali and Descartes were attempting to provide certainty about something that may be inherently uncertain for living humans. But their attempts weren't failures. They were profound explorations that continue to shape how we understand consciousness, spirituality, and mortality. Ghazali's approach offers something Descartes lacks: a lived practice for engaging with mortality. His emphasis on regular remembrance of death, detachment from worldly concerns, and cultivation of spiritual awareness provides concrete ways to live meaningfully in the face of uncertainty. Even if we can't verify his specific claims about the afterlife, his practices can transform how we experience life itself. Descartes' approach offers something Ghazali's lacks: a methodology for questioning received assumptions about death and consciousness. His systematic doubt and emphasis on rational demonstration provide tools for critically examining claims about mortality, including mystical claims. Even if his specific arguments about mind-body dualism prove incorrect, His commitment to rational inquiry advances our understanding. But here's what's most fascinating. Both philosophers agreed on something crucial, that understanding death properly transforms how you live. Ghazali's spiritual practices and Descartes' rational insights both aimed at liberating people from unnecessary fears and pointing them toward authentic existence. The eternal questions. As we conclude this comparison, consider how these two approaches might speak to your own questions about mortality. Are you drawn to Ghazali's emphasis on spiritual preparation and divine relationship? Or does Descartes' rational approach to mind-body separation appeal more to your intellectual sensibilities? Maybe the real wisdom lies in recognizing that both approaches capture something essential about the human experience of mortality. We are beings who need both rational understanding and spiritual meaning. We require both intellectual clarity and heartfelt practice. The mystery of death may be too vast for any single approach to capture completely. In our next video, we'll explore how modern neuroscience and philosophy of mind have grappled with these ancient questions. How do contemporary thinkers address the mind-body problem? What do near-death experiences and consciousness research tell us about these classical debates? But for now, I'll leave you with this question. If you had to choose between Ghazali's certainty based on spiritual experience and Descartes' certainty based on rational demonstration, which would you find more compelling? And what does your answer reveal about your own deepest assumptions about the nature of reality? Death remains the great mystery that every generation must face anew. But as we've seen, how we approach that mystery, through the heart's wisdom or the mind's rigor, shapes not just our understanding of death, but our entire way of being in the world. Perhaps both Al-Ghazali and Descartes remind us that in the face of death, what matters most is how we choose to live. Thank you for joining me on this journey across cultures and centuries. If this exploration resonated with you, please subscribe to Horizons of the Mind, where we continue to wrestle with the profound questions that define human existence. And remember, it's precisely because these questions have no easy answers that they're worth asking. What draws you more, the mystical certainty of Al-Ghazali or the rational certainty of Descartes? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue this conversation across the horizons of the mind.